Ever wondered how something can be perfectly legal in one place, but then you cross a state line and suddenly it's illegal? It seems kind of strange, right? Well, the answer is all wrapped up in this big, powerful idea called American federalism. So let's break it down. I know, it sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? But it's a reality that millions of Americans have to deal with every single day. And this whole puzzle, it's not some weird accident. It's actually at the very heart of how the US government was designed to work from the get-go. And really, there's no better example of this clash today than marijuana. I mean, you've got state after state legalizing it, creating this huge, booming industry. But, and this is the key part, in the eyes of the federal government, it's still an illegal controlled substance. So how on earth does that even work? Okay, so to get our heads around this, here's the game plan. First, we'll dig into that marijuana conflict. Then, we'll define what federalism actually is and check out the constitutional rules. After that, we're going to follow the money to see how it shifts power. And finally, we'll look at why this whole system makes our states so different from each other. All right, let's jump right in with part one, a legal contradiction. We're starting with the marijuana puzzle because, wow, it really shows just how deep this conflict between state and federal power goes. Okay, so the battle lines here are super clear. On one side, you've got the federal government's Controlled Substances Act from way back in 1970. It says, flat out, marijuana is illegal. End of story. But on the other side, you have this growing wave of states, a majority actually, that have legalized it for either medical or recreational use. Now, you might think the Supreme Court would settle this, right? Well, they weighed in back in 2005, and they basically said that, yeah, Congress does have the power to outlaw marijuana, even if it's all happening inside a state that says it's okay. The result? A super confusing legal mess where federal enforcement can swing wildly depending on who's in the White House, leaving businesses and people totally in limbo. So that whole mess brings us right to our second section. What is federalism anyway? To really get this conflict, we need to look at the original blueprint for the government. You know, how was this whole thing supposed to work in the first place? Here's a simple way to think about it. You have to follow the traffic laws of your state, right? But you also have to pay federal income taxes. That's it. That's federalism in action. It's just a system where two or more levels of government, in this case national and state, have formal authority over the exact same area and the exact same people. You and me. And this chart does a great job of showing why federalism is kind of special. See, most countries in the world have what's called a unitary system. That's where the central government calls all the shots. The complete opposite would be a confederation, where the states have all the power. Federalism is this rare thing in the middle. It's a deliberate balancing act where power is shared. And the cool part is, we as citizens get to vote for officials at both levels. Okay, so if power is shared, what happens when the two sides disagree? I mean, who wins? You need a rule book, right? A referee? Well, for the US, that's exactly what the Constitution is supposed to be. This really is the million-dollar question. When a state law says one thing and a federal law says the complete opposite, who gets the final say? The Constitution actually has an answer for this. It's called the Supremacy Clause, and it's basically the ultimate tiebreaker. So think of it like a ladder of laws. At the very top, the highest rung, is the US Constitution itself. Right below that are the laws passed by the national government, as long as they're constitutional, of course, and any treaties. So what this means is pretty simple. If a state law conflicts with a constitutional federal law, the federal law wins, period. And it's not just a suggestion. Every single state official, from the governor on down, takes an oath to uphold this exact hierarchy. But the Constitution doesn't just manage the relationship between the feds and the states. It also lays down the law for how states have to treat each other. Ever wonder why your driver's license from California is still valid in New York? That's something called full faith and credit. Or why a criminal can't just run across a state line to escape the law? That's extradition. And why, if you're visiting Florida from Ohio, you still get the same basic rights and protections? That's privileges and immunities. All these little rules are what keep the country from falling apart into 50 separate little nations. But here's the thing. This relationship between the states and the national government hasn't just stayed the same for 200 plus years. Oh no, it has changed, it's evolved, and probably the single biggest reason for that change, you guessed it, money. For a long time, the US operated under what political scientists call dual federalism. The easiest way to picture it is a layer cake. You have the federal government layer, nice and separate, handling things like national defense. Then you have the state government layer, also separate, handling things like schools. Clear lines. But
that's not really how it works anymore. We've shifted to cooperative federalism, which is much more like a marble cake. All the powers and responsibilities are swirled together. The feds and the states are constantly sharing costs and duties. It's a lot messier, but it's the reality.
So, what's the magic ingredient that swirls that marble cake all together? It's money, a mind boggling amount of money. We're talking about roughly $800 billion that the federal government sends to state and local governments every single year, mostly through grants. And just take a look at where all that cash is going. It's pretty revealing. The lion's share, over 60%, goes to health programs, especially Medicaid. This whole process has a name. It's called fiscal federalism, and it's basically the federal government using its financial power as a tool. By handing out all this money, it can persuade states to do things they might not otherwise do, often by attaching a whole bunch of strings to that cash. Okay, so we've talked about the theory, the history, the money, but what does it all mean for us in the real world? What are the actual consequences? That brings us to our final section, why our states are so different and how this whole system impacts our daily lives. I mean, think about this question for a second. Should whether you live or die depend on where you live? It's a heavy question, but it gets to the very heart of what federalism means. Because states have so much of their own power, the policies they choose can be wildly different. And that means a huge part of your life can literally depend on which side of a state line you happen to live on. Let's take the death penalty as a case study. The policies are all over the map. Some states have it, some don't. Some have put it on pause. But what's really interesting is when you look at the data. States without the death penalty actually tend to have lower murder rates. Now look, that doesn't prove one causes the other, but it perfectly illustrates this key idea of federalism. States act as laboratories of democracy. They can each try out different solutions to really tough problems. And you have to understand, this diversity, it's a feature of the system, not a bug. The whole point of federalism is based on this idea that what works for the people in, say, Texas might be a terrible fit for the people in Vermont. It's designed specifically to let local communities shape their laws to fit their own values and their own needs. And honestly, there are some real advantages to this. Instead of every single little disagreement turning into a giant knockdown, drag-out fight in Washington, D.C., a lot of these issues can be sorted out at the state or local level. And that actually gives more people a real voice in their own government, whether it's at a school board meeting or in their state capital. It just opens up way more doors for people to actually get involved. And that brings us right back to where we started. This system creates what people have called an unending struggle for power. Whether we're talking about healthcare, the environment, civil rights, or, even marijuana, the debate is always raging. Which level of government should be in charge? And that leaves a big question for all of us. As we look at the huge challenges coming our way, how do we decide who is best equipped to handle them, the national government or the states?